In the afternoon of September 1951, a 53-year-old man named Adolf Stiller carried a large cardboard box from his car into a boarding house for young working women in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He walked slowly down the narrow hallway until he reached the room where his two daughters, Bobby and Betty, both 21 years old, were unpacking their suitcases and arranging their belongings. The twins were glowing with excitement. This was their first real step into independence. For the first time in their lives, they were leaving the family home they had grown up in, a small house about an hour away, and starting a life of their own. They had decided to move here together, get jobs at a local cigarette factory, live in the boarding house, and build their future side by side. To them, it felt like crossing the threshold into adulthood. But for their father, the emotions were complicated. He was proud of them, proud that they had grown into young women capable of standing on their own feet. Yet at the same time, there was an ache in his chest. His little girls were no longer children. They were beginning lives that no longer revolved around him. Still, there was one comforting thought. Even though they had left home, they were not truly alone. They shared the same room, worked at the same factory, and had each other. And Adolf knew that even if he and their mother weren't there every day, the girls would always look after one another. Because Bobby and Betty weren't just close sisters, they were identical twins, and their bond went far beyond what most people considered normal, even for twins. They stood the exact same height, about 5'3", with round faces and dark hair styled deliberately the same way. But the similarities didn't stop at appearance. Their personalities, hobbies, and preferences mirrored each other so perfectly that some people wondered if it was intentional. Both were outgoing and warm. They played piano, sang in the school choir, and earned good grades. Yet there was something unusual about them, something harder to explain. They often became sick at the same time, even with illnesses that weren't contagious. Once, Bobby developed a painful dental abscess that left her bedridden. Not long after, Betty suffered an almost identical infection in nearly the same tooth, without any clear medical explanation. Whenever life forced differences between them, they seemed determined to erase those differences. When Bobby had to start wearing glasses due to poor eyesight, Betty insisted on getting glasses too, despite having perfectly good vision, simply so they would continue to look alike. Even moving out of their parents' home had to happen identically. Same job, same factory, same room. Deep down, Adolf and his wife secretly hoped that, with time, the girls might learn to develop a little independence from each other. They believed it would be healthier for their future. But as Adolf set the last box on the floor and looked at his daughters, smiling in perfect synchronization, he had no idea that what lay ahead would go far beyond an unusually strong twin bond. At that moment, watching their excited faces, he felt only relief and gratitude. It made sense to him that they were taking this step together, just as they always had. Maybe, he thought, this was simply a gentle transition into adulthood. For now, they could lean on each other a little longer, until eventually each would build her own life, marry, and move forward. A few minutes later, he hugged them goodbye. "I love you, girls," he said. "Call me anytime you need anything." Then he left, got into his car, and drove home. 2 years later, Adolf Stiller was setting the dinner table while his wife finished cooking in their small home in Bear Creek, North Carolina. He had just placed the final plate on the table when a knock echoed through the house. His face lit up instantly. It was the weekend, and his daughters usually came home to visit every week. He smiled to himself, certain Bobby and Betty had arrived for dinner and another family weekend together. Since the girls moved out, those visits had become precious moments for both parents. Adolf hurried to the door and opened it, but what he saw stopped him cold. Standing there was Bobby, alone. Betty wasn't with her. "Where's Betty?" he asked immediately. "Is she still in the car?" Bobby shook her head. Only then did Adolf notice the suitcases in her hands and the deep sadness written across her face. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, concern rising in his voice. She hesitated before answering. "I hate the factory job," she said quietly. "I really hate it. I quit, and I came back home. I'm going to live here again." She paused, but Betty doesn't feel the same. She wants to stay, keep working, and live there alone. For Adolf, the words were shocking. The twins had never made separate decisions before. They had always done everything together. Even when one of them disliked something, she would go along with it for the sake of her sister. The idea that one twin would leave while the others stayed behind felt completely unnatural. Still, he forced a smile. "Of course you're welcome home," he said gently. "This will always be your house." "But why isn't Betty visiting this weekend? Even if she's staying there, couldn't she come spend some time with us?" Bobby simply replied, "She decided not to come." The sense of unease grew stronger for both parents, but Adolf quickly tried to ease the tension. "Come inside," he said warmly. "Let's eat, get some rest, and figure things out later. What matters is that you're home." Bobby walked in, but after a short while, she said she wasn't hungry. She carried her bags upstairs, entered her room, closed the door, and didn't come back down. From that day forward, for nearly 2 full years, Bobby lived almost entirely confined to her bedroom. She rarely left. She became emotionally withdrawn, shutting herself off from the world. She never explained why she had left the factory or what had upset her so deeply. She stopped contacting old friends and made no effort to form new relationships. The once outgoing, lively young woman transformed into a recluse. She didn't look for work. She didn't plan for the future. It was as if she had surrendered completely to remaining inside that room forever. Yet something strange happened during those 2 years. Whenever Betty came home to visit on weekends, Bobby would suddenly return to her old self. The moment Betty walked through the door, Bobby seemed to awaken from emotional paralysis. Laughing again, social, energetic, completely normal. The sisters interacted as if nothing had ever changed. No resentment, no distance, no unanswered questions. But as soon as Betty left and returned to the factory, Bobby would retreat back to her room, close the door, and disappear into isolation once again. And still, Adolf and his wife held on to hope that somehow their daughters would eventually learn to live independent lives. Emily had managed to build a life for herself. She worked at a textile factory outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, living alone for the first time. On the surface, everything looked stable. She paid her rent, held a steady job, and proved she could survive independently. But back home, things were falling apart. Her twin sister was slowly collapsing without her. Their father and mother watched helplessly as Claire changed. She barely spoke, rarely left the house, and seemed emotionally hollow. Anyone who saw her could tell she had depended entirely on her sister her whole life. Richard didn't know how this story would end, but with every passing month, Claire's condition worsened. For 2 full years, the family tried everything: encouragement, routine, patience, but nothing helped. Then something strange happened. On a Friday evening, exactly 2 years after leaving home, Emily suddenly walked through the front door carrying her bags. "I quit my job," she said calmly. "I'm moving back home." The announcement shocked everyone. Strangely, Richard and Margaret felt relieved. They believed the twins would finally return to their old rhythm, the inseparable bond they had shared since childhood. Maybe Claire would recover now that her other half was back, and at first, it seemed like salvation. Claire's face lit up in a way they hadn't seen in years, but something about Emily's decision didn't sit right with Richard. Emily had loved her independence. She had seemed happy living alone. There was no clear reason for her sudden return. Still, he had no proof, only a feeling. The twins had always done everything together, even when one of them didn't truly want to. It felt as if Emily had sacrificed her future just to reunite with her sister. The parents convinced themselves this was a good sign. They were wrong. The moment Emily returned, the twins became synchronized again, but not in a healthy way. They moved into Claire's bedroom together and shut the door. For nearly 24 hours straight, they didn't come out. Instead of becoming social again, they withdrew completely from the world. They stopped looking for work. They stopped seeing friends. They stopped living normal lives. They simply stayed in that room, together, always together. They slept in the same bed every night. When they left the room, which became increasingly rare, they walked side by side so closely their shoulders touched constantly. Every movement mirrored the other. If one lifted a spoon, the other lifted hers at the exact same second. If one turned her head, the other followed instantly. It was as if each sister had become a reflection of the other. They entered the bathroom together, left together, sat together, never separated. To their parents, the attachment became deeply unsettling, far beyond ordinary sibling closeness. It looked like extreme psychological dependency, something neither Richard nor Margaret could even name. Still, they hoped time would fix it. It didn't. Soon, the situation grew darker. The twins stopped eating. At first, it seemed harmless. Maybe they simply weren't hungry. Richard would knock on the bedroom door at dinner time. The door would open slightly. Both faces appeared in the gap at the same moment. "Dinner's ready," he would say gently. Without looking at each other, they answered in perfect unison, "We're not hungry," and the door would close. Days passed, then a week. The twins refused food entirely. Their weight dropped rapidly, their bodies weakened. Fear replaced denial. Richard and Margaret finally understood that logic and conversation weren't reaching them anymore. Something was seriously wrong. Believing it was a mental health crisis, they took both daughters to a psychiatrist. The doctor didn't need long to reach a conclusion. Both Emily and Claire were diagnosed with schizophrenia, a severe psychiatric disorder affecting perception, behavior, and connection to reality. The diagnosis seemed to explain everything: their isolation, refusal to eat, obsessive dependence on each other, growing paranoia toward everyone else. The psychiatrist prescribed antipsychotic medication and reassured Richard that treatment could stabilize them if they followed it consistently. Their parents strictly monitored every dose, but nothing improved. In fact, things became worse. The twins spent even more time locked inside the bedroom. They barely ate at all. Their bodies grew fragile, and their behavior turned increasingly paranoid, even toward their own parents. It seemed the only person either sister could tolerate was the other. They hid from the world entirely. Richard struggled with doubt. The symptoms matched schizophrenia perfectly, yet the treatment failed. If the diagnosis was correct, why wasn't anything working? Eventually, he reached a painful conclusion. They needed stronger intervention. In early 1961, when Emily and Claire were 30 years old, Richard made the decision no parent ever wants to make. Against their will, he admitted both daughters to a psychiatric hospital. At first, the treatment seemed to work. Inside the psychiatric hospital, Emily and Claire began gaining weight again. Meals were mandatory, medications were carefully monitored, and nurses watched them around the clock. For the first time in years, the twins looked physically healthier. One important decision helped their recovery. The hospital did not separate them. They shared the same room, and psychologically, that seemed to calm them. Within weeks, doctors described their condition as stable enough for discharge. They went home, and everything collapsed again. Almost immediately, the twins locked themselves inside their bedroom. They stopped eating. They isolated themselves. Their mental state deteriorated rapidly. They were admitted back to the hospital. Once inside, they improved again. Then, they were released and relapsed again. The same cycle repeated for more than a year. Hospital to recovery, to release to collapse. Over and over. Doctors, nurses, and the parents eventually faced a terrifying question. Was schizophrenia truly the core problem, or was the real illness the extreme psychological dependence between the twins? What once appeared to be an unbreakable sisterly bond now looked dangerously unhealthy. Emily and Claire seemed incapable of developing identities separate from each other. They weren't growing as individuals. They were emotionally frozen in place. If nothing changed, doctors feared their condition would only worsen. So, a final decision was made. A decision neither sister was allowed to influence: forced separation. On April 11, 1962, the twins were admitted to the hospital once again, but this time was different. For the first time in their lives, Emily and Claire were placed in completely separate wings, far enough apart that they could neither see nor hear one another. The reaction was immediate. They screamed, they cried, they begged doctors to keep them together. Hospital staff insisted it was necessary for their recovery. Hours passed. Then, shortly after 1:30 a.m., Richard was awakened by the ringing telephone. Confused, he answered. On the other end was a doctor from the hospital. His voice was shaken. He tried explaining what had happened after the twins were separated, but Richard struggled to understand. The words sounded impossible. Finally, the doctor stopped speaking for a moment, then delivered the devastating truth. Something had happened that no one predicted. Something no medical training could explain. Richard stood frozen, holding the receiver in silence. In the days that followed, doctors searched desperately for answers. Psychiatrists reviewed every record. State investigators were consulted. Eventually, even the Federal Bureau of Investigation became involved. No explanation was found. The story leaked to the press and spread across newspapers throughout the United States, quickly becoming a national mystery, an event many readers described as impossible to believe. Some began asking a frightening question. What if this wasn't purely science? What if there were human connections beyond understanding? The confirmed timeline was chilling. At 12:55 a.m., a nurse performing routine rounds entered Claire's room. She found her lying peacefully on her side in bed, dead. No signs of struggle, no illness, no injury. 5 minutes later, around 1 a.m., a doctor checked on Emily in the opposite wing of the hospital. She too was dead, lying in bed, in the exact same position. Medical examinations revealed nothing. No poisoning, no self-harm, no violence, no detectable disease. Multiple autopsies failed to identify any cause. The official ruling read, "Cause of death, undetermined." The only theory came from one of the treating psychiatrists. He suggested the forced separation created unbearable psychological trauma. The twins' bond had been so intense, emotionally, mentally, even physically, that separation itself may have triggered a voluntary shutdown of life. As if, unable to live apart, they chose to reunite another way. The idea sounded irrational, until investigators noticed one final detail. Both bodies had been found lying strangely across their beds. A bed is rectangular. People normally sleep lengthwise, but Emily and Claire were positioned at sharp angles, almost sideways across their mattresses. At first, it seemed like coincidence. Then, someone made a disturbing observation. If the walls separating their hospital rooms were removed, their bodies would have been oriented directly toward each other, as if, in their final moments, even separated by distance, they had turned instinctively to face one another, refusing to be apart, even in death. And to this day, no scientific explanation has ever fully answered what happened that night. If this story fascinated you, don't forget to like and share the video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. New episodes every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Until next time, stay curious and sleep carefully.